Our next speaker is Dr. Monica Marks, who is Assistant Professor of Arab Crossroads Studies at NYU Abu Dhabi. And Monica, when you say in conclusion, 7 more minutes.
What's that, sorry?
When you say in conclusion, you can get 7.
Okay. No, sorry. All right. Can everybody hear me okay? If I speak to you from here? All right, cool. I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'll just be lazy and relaxed. And Dalia, if you could just throw your hand up when I have, like, let's say, like 2 or 3 more minutes. Awesome, thanks. All right, so today I'm focusing on Ennahda's time in power, its brief time at or near the helm of government. I imagine everybody in this room knows what Ennahda is. Ennahda, whose name means the Renaissance in Arabic, is the main so-called Islamist party in Tunisia. And those of you who've talked to me about this topic before, or who have read or listened to me talking about it, know that I never call Ennahda an Islamist party without problematizing that word, just as I never call someone like Sisi in Egypt a secular autocrat. I'll get more into this as I go, but these words, secular and Islamist, often confuse a lot more than they clarify. Now, Ennahda, even though it's been institutionally separate from the Ikhwan, i.e. the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, since its birth in the early 1970s, it's often seen as the local franchise, like your local chain of the Ikhwani McDonald's, the local franchise of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, but it's not. I want to start by separating some evidence-based versus non-evidence-based, some intelligent versus some unintelligent criticisms of Ennahda that you'll commonly hear, even still today. Then I'm going to talk about what Ennahda got right versus wrong, at the risk of sounding victim-blaming, because Ennahda very much is the victim right now, and I don't want to sound like that, but I do want to have an honest analytical discussion about what Ennahda got right versus wrong. And then lastly, some lessons to take from this entire experience. So let's get started. Evidence versus non-evidence-based criticisms of Ennahda. Ennahda has been existing in a pool of disinformation since the 2011 revolution. For decades before 2011, under the prior dictators in Tunisia, Bourguiba and Ben Ali, there was tons and tons of propaganda and misinformation about Ennahda that sought to portray Ennahda as a terrorist actor, as a violent, extremist Islamist actor, rather than as what it was, which was a peaceful, center-right conservative party that just wanted to compete in free and fair elections. Why did Bourguiba and Ben Ali do all that disinformation? Well, because Ennahda was the most politically threatening actor and they wanted to demonize it. So even today, you'll hear common criticisms of Ennahda from the Tunisian left and from a lot of civil society type people that we would all in this room interface with if we were working at an embassy in Tunisia or we were working with Tunisian civil society. You'll still hear from corners of this world, and in fact some of the most influential corners of this Tunisian world that interface most regularly with Western actors from the World Bank and IMF to the US Embassy and others, the following criticisms, which are not evidence-based. You'll hear them say that Ennahda facilitated jihadists fighting in Syria between 2012 and 2014 when Ennahda was leading the government with 2 other parties in a so-called troika. So you'll hear that they supported jihadism critique. No evidence for this, but you'll still hear it. You'll also hear that Ennahda was behind, somehow, the assassinations of Shukri Belaid and Mohamed Brahmi in the year 2013. Again, there's no evidence for that, but you'll still hear the criticism a lot. You'll also hear a lot of Tunisians say that Ennahda was engaged in wild kinds of corruption, the likes of which other Tunisian politicians were not. Again, no evidence for that. And a fourth criticism that you'll hear a lot of Ennahda is that they didn't do enough for security sector reform, especially between 2012 and 2014 when they were at the helm with the revolutionary troika, these 2 secular parties in a coalition government. Now, I think that fourth criticism, there's some truth to it, but to imagine that Ennahda was going to be the tip of the spear for security sector reform in Tunisia at that time period is contextually unaware. It's as if you would imagine that Black Lives Matter, let's say they got the governorship of New York, that it's going to be Black Lives Matter that leads police reform. In other words, you're expecting the victim to be the main reformist that holds the perpetrator accountable. And we know from the comparative study of democratization and post-authoritarian situations that often the victims will be ideologically suspect because of decades, years of disinformation. We also know that victims are not well respected often amongst the security sector. These are not people who, when they come to power, find a usable bureaucracy very easily. And the example I always give there is Ali Larayat, one of the most powerful people in Ennahda, had been tortured, he'd been raped, his wife had been subject to absolutely horrific abuse. He had been held in solitary confinement for nearly 16 years in the basement of the Ministry of Interior. And after Tunisia's first free and fair elections, who becomes the first Minister of Interior? It's Ali Larayat. Now that was an amazing moment to watch Mr. Larayat stride into the Ministry of Interior. Emotionally inspiring, incredible. But what do the people who work inside that building think of Ali Larayat? They've been taught to see him for decades as scum, as a rat, as something subhuman. So there was a real question about whether or not Ennahda really had usable bureaucracy to make these sorts of changes. So those four criticisms that I just detailed, most of which imply that Ennahda supported terrorism, or that it was more corrupt than other parties in Tunisia, or that it had the ability to make security sector reform a reality and just didn't do it because of whatever reason. Those criticisms are not evidence-based. There are criticisms, there's another set, that I would say are more evidence-based. That Ennahda's leadership became increasingly calcified and unresponsive over the years. That Ghannouchi started to threaten internal democracy inside Ennahda in some ways, that it became less welcoming for young people and critical voices. I think that there is some evidence to those criticisms. But often it's the people who know Ennahda best who make them. It's people who were in Ennahda and defected, or who are still in Ennahda, that you'll hear those criticisms from. From people who don't know Ennahda, you'll often hear a lot of that disinformation that I discussed still, and it's still very politically potent. So what did Ennahda get right versus wrong? I think Ennahda got a lot of things right. In fact, Ennahda got so many things right that now a lot of scholars and cousin-like Islamists in the rest of the MENA region are looking at what happened in Tunisia and saying, well, if Ennahda gave away the whole house like this, and their leaders are still in prison again, possibly being tortured again after all of this, there's absolutely nothing that we can do right, so screw this. Yeah, I'm hearing a lot of that from the so-called Islamist right in the MENA region more broadly. But I don't think that Ennahda lost, or that Tunisia's democracy got obliterated because Ennahda was not Islamist enough. And I do not think that Ennahda lost, or that Tunisia's democracy got obliterated because it was too Islamist. In fact, Ennahda did a lot of right things and wrong things, neither one of which were really related to Islamism all that much. The right things Ennahda did. Ennahda had, at least until 2016, until its most recent party congress, Ennahda had much more internal democracy than any other political party in Tunisia. And that contrasts just wildly from, let's say, Turkey. Turkey was often held up as a model for Muslim Democrats, but if you look at the internal elections for Erdogan inside the ruling party, AKP, he never won with anything less than 96%. No political party in Turkey, AKP included, has been democratic. Ennahda has been quite a different world. Has Ennahda's internal democracy been perfect? Absolutely not. Like I said, especially since 2016, it's become more unresponsive and more calcified. But there was internal checks and balances inside Ennahda. There was real competition for who the next leader would be. At the 2016 Congress, it was not at all clear that Ghannouchi was going to win re-election as the next leader. So I think that was a bonus. That allowed Ennahda's leaders to make a lot of compromises whilst keeping most of the party on board. That was what my PhD was about at Oxford, an internal ethnography of Ennahda since the revolution. They really did some amazing things. 2 more minutes? Okay, great. They also made a lot of compromises, not just on the classically Islamist issues like Sharia and blasphemy that we've all heard about, but on more important political issues like lustration. They almost voted a lustration law in Tunisia that would have stopped the old regime people from contesting the second round of Tunisia's, well, the second free and fair elections in Tunisia in 2014, and Ennahda voted against that. Those were big wins that allowed the transition to be preserved. However, where Ennahda started to stumble more was in making this pivot between the giveaways and the compromises that it needed to do to help Tunisia's democracy survive in its first stage let's say between 2011 and 2015 or 16, and pivoting towards making the kinds of reforms needed to help Tunisia's democracy survive in the second stage. So let's say since 2015, 2016. For example, throwing its full weight behind the creation of a judiciary, consolidating Tunisia's judicial branch, creating a Supreme Court. Ennahda didn't do that. Ennahda didn't focus enough on an economic reform program. They lost sight of their vision for Tunisia, and to a lot of average Tunisians, it started to look more like Sheikh Rashid, like Ghanouchi, wanted to simply maintain his seat, and the other leaders wanted to maintain their seat without providing a mobilizing vision. So just a couple lessons, I'll just name these without describing them to take away. Islamism in Tunisia does not equal Ennahda. I think we should all be very careful before we call Ennahda an Islamist party. Nobody should be calling CSID secular. CSID is way more Islamist in rhetoric and policy than Ennahda. And if you look at polling in Tunisia shows that more Tunisians than ever, including young people, are now supporting quote-unquote political Islam in terms of policy. CSID is much more Islamist in terms of rhetoric and policy. So don't conflate these things necessarily. Whenever you hear the words Islamist, secularist, etc. in Tunisia, be very, very critical. Secondly, propaganda dies hard. Ennahda dealt with decades of propaganda, and it's coming back to haunt them. I think Ennahda lost not because of Islamism, because it was too much or too little Islamist, but because it was the most visible figurehead and the most convenient whipping boy when things went south in Tunisia, economically and otherwise. Reforming the judiciary is very important. Not having a consolidated judiciary branch really mattered. And the fact that Ennahda ruled during the period where you had the most jihadist attacks, that was very unfortunate. When people feel afraid but for their security, like when there's jihadist attacks, they'll often vote for very anti-democratic despotism, and you need a judiciary to counteract that, and there wasn't one in Tunisia, so you had a lot of security sector draconianism that only continued until today. And then just lastly, I'll say we need to move beyond the Islamist secularist framework to understand what's happening in Tunisia and the region more broadly. From 2011 to 2014, when there really were some amazing transitional windows that we could have taken advantage of, almost all of my time talking to US or EU decision makers was eaten up by their obsession with Islamism. What does Ennahda really want? What is Ennahda's real agenda? This whole obsession with the Islamist secular debate shaped a huge amount of the coverage and a huge amount of the intellectual bandwidth here in DC and beyond. We weren't thinking enough about corruption. We weren't thinking enough about the economy. We weren't thinking enough about creating a strong judicial sector. Thanks.